All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking this extra step to be prepared to hike on the AT in 2021. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I am Chloe DeCamera, the Trail Education Specialist with ATC. I'm based out of Asheville, North Carolina, and I thru hiked Nobo in 2015, and I became a full-time employee with ATC at the end of 2015. I oversee the Ridge Runner program in Georgia and the Smokies, and I support our education and outreach efforts by working with teachers and students in Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And I also have the privilege of working with AT communities in those 3 states as well. I'll let my co-presenter, Lori Pottiger, introduce herself.
Hey, I'm Lori Pottiger, Information Services Manager at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy at the Harpers Ferry headquarters office. And I hiked the AT from Georgia to Maine in 1987, then came to work for ATC. And since then, I've hiked all the trail again in pieces, except for 50 miles. And super excited to be talking to you all about alternative to hikes today.
Let's take a moment to talk about COVID-19. If you've been following ATC's communications at all this year, you know that we've asked everyone to postpone their long distance hike. The pandemic is still ongoing, so we haven't changed our guidance. Hiking is a form of interstate travel, which makes it a public health risk. The safest thing for hikers and for the communities they pass through would be for everyone to continue to put off their long distance hiking plans and stay local. We continue to monitor the situation in all 14 states and hope for good news. But until there's an effective, widely available vaccine or treatment for COVID-19, we will not be encouraging long distance hikes or recognizing 2,000 milers. So you might be wondering, why are we hosting this session with advice for long distance hikers? Well, it appears that people are still going out on long hikes in 2021, and that for folks who made that choice, they want to be ready in all ways that hikers have always been prepared. ATC is in a unique position to reach out to people who are considering a long hike with information that we hope will minimize the risk of COVID-19 outbreaks among hikers and along the trail. ATC hosting these sessions does not mean that it's safe or advisable to thru hike in 2021. It means that we're determined to do what we can to minimize the risk. So let's talk about some basics. To make sure that we all have a good foundation of AT knowledge, the trail itself is a national scenic trail. It is 2,193 miles long, goes from Springer Mountain in North Georgia as the southern terminus all the way to the northern terminus at Katahdin in Baxter State Park. It goes through 14 states, 6 national parks, 8 national forests, and a plethora of state parks and some private land as well. It is estimated that about 3 to 4 million visitors take to the trail every year. And if you think about the number of thru hikers, there's about 4,000 to 5,000 thru hikers that attempt the trail to hike it in its entirety every year. So 3 to 4 million, that's a lot of day hikers or people that are going out just for a couple days at a time. The AT is maintained, managed, and protected through the cooperative management system. You might be asking yourself, why are we talking about management? I'm here to learn about flip-flopping, but it's really just to let you know that there's a partnership along the AT and it continually changes depending on what section of the trail you're on. There are 87 distinct land managers, 31 maintaining clubs. Those are the little icons you see there on the right along the trail. And then the continuous partner along the whole AT is the ATC. So if you're in Georgia, that partnership could look like the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest, the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club, and ATC. But if you're in the Smokies, it would be the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, and ATC. So it's crucial that you understand there's different regulations, different styles of management, different clubs that are actually the boots on the ground. And so adaptability is crucial to a successful hike on the AT. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the 6,000 plus volunteers that contribute over 200,000 hours of service every year. If you ever see people doing some trail maintenance along the AT while you're hiking, definitely say thank you, but maybe even ask, how can I join? So there are different ways to hike these 2,193 miles. You can through hike, which is 12 months or less, hiking the entire trail. You can go northbound starting at Springer Mountain, southbound starting at Katahdin, or you can flip-flop. And I don't want to take anything away from Lori, so she'll dive into that later. You can section hike, which is still aiming to complete the entire trail one day, but not doing it within a 12-month period. So you can do it as a lasher, a long ass section hiker. I know people that have done it over a period of 25 years, and I know people that have done it in 2 years. And there's everything in between, obviously. And then you can also day hike the trail. That means that you are coming back home every night. You're not staying out there overnight. And don't be fooled. You can through hike the Appalachian Trail as day hikes. People have done it before. It just takes a little bit more planning and coordination. So now that we know how to hike the AT, let's talk about how you want to hike the AT. We're going to take a moment to reflect and think about what our desired experiences on the AT. Some people will answer solitude, community, friendship, putting a goal out there and seeing it through. I personally want to have as much moss as possible while I'm out there. So let's take 30 seconds to reflect. Okay, hold on to those desired experiences. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But for now, let's look at the data and see how many people are actually out there. Here is some data points from 1990. This is all on through hikers. You can see this orange line here. This is those that have attempted and registered their hike as a northbound hiker. Green are hikers that have reported their hikes as completed to the ATC. Blue are southbounders, and then starting in 2015 down here you see our flip-flop data. I just want you guys to take a moment to soak it in. Maybe put in the chat box what you think happened in 1990, what happened in 2007 and 8 to make it such a steady dip and start to increase in 2008. And then if anyone can guess what happened to make there be such a sudden increase in 2013 all the way to 2019. All right, any answers, any guesses?
Everybody must just still be digesting it. Oh, we've got A Walk in the Woods, the movie, as one guess. And then I guess Bill Bryson's book came out in 1998.
Yep, nailed it. It was not Y2K. Bill Bryson's book came out in 1997 or 8, which had a drastic increase on the popularity of AT in our culture. So a lot of people wanted to go out and have a walk in the woods. And then once the economy crashed, it felt like no better time to get on the trail than 2008. And I think with the rise of social media, the film adaptations of A Walk in the Woods and Wild, you start to see a lot more hikers out there. So remember your desired experience and think back to that and compare that with these numbers. Also, I welcome you to compare the number of northbound hikes that start their hike, hikers that start their hike to the people that complete their hike. Some considerations once you've decided what type of hike you want are terrain, crowd, and weather. So let's say, for example, you want to hike southbound. You think that would help you achieve your desired experience more. Just a heads up that you have the hardest hike of the entire AT on day 1. That is Katahdin. And as you can see, they actually don't believe in switchbacks in Katahdin. And they blast rebarb into rock. So you are doing hand over foot climbing. If it's inclement weather, if there's any snow up there, you're actually doing mountaineering at that point. Crowds are huge considerations for this year in particular. I took this photo in 2016 in the Smokies. You'll know once you get into the park, you are required to sleep at designated campsites. And historically, you're required to sleep inside the shelter. ATC is recommending that hikers do not stay inside shelters this year. And the Smokies is allowing hikers and through hikers to avoid sleeping inside the shelter, but they still have to sleep at the designated site. So this picture in particular, we had a shelter that could sleep a max of 12 people. We had 20 people on the wooden platforms that night, and you actually can't see it, but down here there are 4 people sleeping on the floor. So what I want you to envision is the lack of tent sites that might be available if no one is sleeping inside the shelter this year. These sites are not made for 50 tents, and sometimes that's the amount of people that you can get at a shelter site. And then, of course, weather. I would say the most common misconception for northbound hikers is people assuming that it's warm in the south. I worked in the Smokies for 3 seasons, and every season we had a snowstorm the first week of May. And of course, what better way to celebrate spring than 8 inches of snow? Another consideration is leave no trace. We're not going to go over all 7 principles, but we do encourage you to take this free online awareness course for Leave No Trace. I think commonly the principles get boiled down to pack it in, pack it out, or or leave it better than you found it. It's so much more than that, and the more you know, the more prepared you'll be. But we really want you guys to take away proper waste disposal, how to dig a proper cat hole. Make sure that you're carrying a trowel when you're out there. Dig a cat hole 6 to 8 inches, 200 feet is the magic number, away from the trail, away from a water source, from your overnight campsite. And the only things you should be putting in your cat hole is toilet paper and human waste. Please do not put flushable wipes, biodegradable wipes in the soil. They do not decompose. And as someone that has cleaned over 100 privies in the Smokies, I can say with certainty that the #1 piece of trash I pack out is biodegradable wipes that did not decompose. Also, proper food storage. ATC recommends that all hikers carry bear canisters. And if you choose to do a food hang or carry an sack, make sure that you are confident in the skills required for those 2 styles of food storage, whether it be knot tying for the sack or actually throwing the line over the branch for a food hang. Bears usually get into bear hangs more easily than any of those 3 options, and that's because of human error. Another tool for your successful hike is atcamp.org. Make sure that you're registering your hike. All we need is the starting date and location. You can see some 2021 numbers down here. We do have a red line where ATC recommends that hikers don't go over. And this is really when I want you guys to reflect back on your desired experience. Is it solitude? Because if it is, then maybe starting on March 15th with 30 plus other hikers isn't going to help you achieve that experience. This is a great tool for you to decide when and where you want to start your hike, and how you can have the best trip possible, and maybe also help you consider or solidify your idea of doing a flip-flop hike. Some pro tips on atcamp.org. It's best used on a desktop, but it can be used on a phone. All we need is the start date. It's not a reservation. You will still need to get your permits for the Smokies, Shenandoah, and Baxter. And through hikers do not need to select campsites, just the starting point, as I said. You cannot change your registration. If your plans change, cancel the old and create a new registration, and check your inbox or junk mail for your confirmation message and save it. So let's move on to safety, just some general tips. This is coming from my perception of safety on the AT. I am a young white woman hiking the AT. My experience is not universal, so please take that into consideration. Some tips: listen to your gut. If someone or something ever makes you feel uncomfortable on the AT, don't question it and move on. Please report incidences on the Appalachian Trail at appalachiantrail.org/incidences. If it is a 911 emergency, please call 911 first. Share your itinerary and check in regularly with your friends and family at home. Cell coverage can be spotty along the AT, so you might consider carrying a satellite communication device, and also giving your friends and family the benefit of the doubt that they might not hear from you for a couple days, and that's normal. If you carry firearms along the Appalachian Trail, remember those 87 distinct land managers, they all have different regulations. So make sure you're acting in accordance with those land managers and the 14 states. And if it's truly just about safety with animals, maybe consider bear spray. And always stay on top of weather forecast and hazards along the AT. When you leave town, make sure you're checking that forecast before you head out. Some pro tips: don't be on a granite rock summit when it's a lightning storm. Personal experience. And then safety for COVID-19. We are expanding our definition of personal protective equipment. Make sure you have a face covering and keep a spare in your first aid kit in case you come across someone that's exhibiting symptoms. And also your personal shelter is now part of your PPE. Like I said earlier, we are asking that all hikers do not sleep inside shelters, and they also do not use privy. So make sure you have your trowel and washing kit and or hand sanitizer. And please make sure that you are wearing masks and when you're traveling into and going about towns. We really want you to represent a shared standard of safety among hikers, and you are representing the AT through hiking culture. So please be an ambassador for safety. And gear, I know everyone loves to talk about gear, but I'm not going to get too into detail here. Honestly, if you had Catherine, Lori, Stephen, and myself in a room, you would have 4 different gear setups, and it's all what works best for us individually. But make sure you have the big 3, your backpack, a sleeping system, which includes your bag and your pad or quilt, your own personal shelter, whether that be a hammock, a tarp, or a tent. They can all be roughly 3 pounds each, if not lighter, if you want to go ultralight. Your trowel is crucial. A food storage system. ATC recommends that all hikers carry bear canisters, and your COVID-19 PPE that we just referenced as a face covering and hand sanitizer. Some pro tips: shoot for a fully loaded pack weight of 25% or less of your body weight for a healthy distribution for your knees. And do a shakedown hike once you have your desired gear for at least 3 days. And I stress that 3 days, 2 nights, because it's really easy to haphazardly pack your backpack if you are only out there for a night the next morning, because you know you're on your way to a warm bed and a shower. Bonus points if you choose this shakedown hike for cold and rainy and slushy weather, because that's how you know your gear works. And finally, before we move on to Lori, let's just talk about some logistics. There are regulations that vary along the AT, whether it be dogs, designated camping spots, campfires, and food storage. So make sure you stay alert and know how they evolve along the AT. Permits: the only permit you have to pay for in the park is in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. That's a $20 through hiking permit, and it gives you 7 to 8 days to get through the entire 71 miles of the AT in the park. I mentioned earlier, you're also required to sleep at designated sites. Shenandoah is extremely easy. You just walk up to a kiosk, write out all your information on a permit there, rip off the carbon copy and stuff it in the box and carry the permit on your person. In Baxter State Park, you can get the Katahdin Summit permit at Katahdin Stream Campground. Another pro tip: once you have these permits, keep them in a Ziploc bag. There's nothing more awkward than handing a Ridge Runner or a Ranger a disintegrating piece of wet paper that's been balled up in your side pocket for 5 days. And make sure you're considering transportation, not only for when you're into town, but if you're doing a flip-flop, make sure that you're thinking about transportation from your flip to your flop. And as always, please register your hike on atcamp.org. Let's go to Lori to talk to us a little bit more about alternative hikes.
Hey, Chloe, thanks for that fantastic overview covering how to hike safely and sustainably, and all those great tips. So thank you all for being here and for your interest in alternative through hikes. By the way, ATC tends to think of alternative through hikes as the flip-flop through hikes and not so much southbound. When we talk about alternatives, we talk about alternatives to no-bow and so-bow. So I'll explain some more about what alternative through hikes or flip-flops are. It's hiking the entire AT in any sequence other than straight through in one direction in 12 months or less. and it's not constrained by a calendar year. It's just 12 months. There are literally infinite variations, and part of what we're going to do here today is talk about some of the ones that we know have worked well for people. And although some people are not that familiar with flip-flops, they have actually been around since 1952. And ATC has actively been promoting them since 2015. We use the term alternative through hike and flip-flop through hike pretty much interchangeably. And no, flip-flop through hiking has nothing to do with flip-flops. The name comes because of the association with change in direction, but also it can be hiking the trail all in the same direction, but just in different sequences. So hopping around. Okay, so why do a flip-flop through hike if the vast majority of through hikers through time have done no bows and a handful of so bows? Well, the biggest one, and the reason it sort of came to ATC's attention, was as a way for hikers to avoid crowds. And during COVID, that's even a bigger consideration than normal. The way you structure most through hikes at flip-flops, it also allows you to have milder weather throughout the course of your entire journey by working with elevation and latitude, working those things to your advantage so you're avoiding both extremes of heat and cold. You can structure your hike so that you have the easiest terrain in the beginning, which we'll talk about a little more in a bit. There's also, as northbounders have, you don't have to worry about the deadline of Baxter State Park. October 15th is when you're recommended to get there, and when the park sometimes closes to overnight camping, but you can be shut out by bad weather at any time. This year, 2020, the park closed October 16th. There was 1 year, 20-some years ago, that it closed first week of October and didn't reopen. A lot of hikers were shut out. On the other end, southbounders can't start typically until June. So the flip-flop allows you not to worry about any of those dates. Another hidden secret of these flip-flop variations is they allow you to see fall colors in the mid-Atlantic and the South, which can be really spectacular. And the thing is, on a northbound through hike, most northbounders, or many of them, don't really see a lot of fall colors, which you associate with New England, because you're up high in the evergreen forests. And I know on my northbound hike, I saw hardly any fall colors, even though in theory I should have. I just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But another great thing about flip-flop through hike is it helps protect the AT by dispersing use. It lessens the impacts on the trail itself, on campsites, on privies, and on volunteers. So a little bit more about the history of how flip-flop through hikes came to be, because it seems to be a mystery to a lot of people. Peace Pilgrim was actually the first female through hiker, and you may not have heard of her because Grandma Gatewood is so much better known. Grandma Gatewood actually hiked the trail 3 times, and she was a very colorful personality and loved to talk about her through hike. She was even on one of the most popular TV shows at the time, cracking jokes that were somewhat suggestive, because she had so many kids and grandkids, talking with Groucho Marx about that. Peace Pilgrim, on the other hand, was someone who didn't talk much about her through hike. On her through hike in 52, she hiked with a man, with a partner, someone who was not her husband, quite shocking in the 50s. They hiked from Georgia up to Pennsylvania, flipped up north to Katahdin, walked south to their starting point, but along the way did a side trip to hike the Long Trail in Vermont. In the course of her journey, Peace Pilgrim had an epiphany that she wanted to devote the rest of her life to walking to promote peace. And after she started doing that, she literally did do that and didn't talk much about her through hike. So that's why we don't know as much about her, because she had another mission. The first male to flip-flop that we know of, and also the person we know of to do a through hike starting intentionally in the middle of the trail is a guy by the name of Jim Hodges, who just walked out his door in Central Virginia and started his northbound flip-flop from Cold Mountain, if you're familiar where that is. The reason ATC started actively promoting the flip-flop was when you saw those graphs earlier, when we saw the numbers really climbing as the trail got popular with exposure through books and videos and movies. We recognized that, we didn't want to limit the number of through hikers, but the trail could sustain a whole lot more through hikers if they were only spread out in space and time. Because any of you who have spent a lot of time on the trail know that most places on the trail, most of the time, are not crowded. It's just some places are, like Springer Mountain for 6 or 8 weeks in Georgia, in the hot spots. But if you spread people out in both space and time, the trail can accommodate a whole lot more people. And as we started studying through hikes, actually, since I took my Leave No Trace Master Educator course in '98, that got me thinking about this very thing, because Bill Bryson's book had just been published. And so I started studying flip-flops and talking to every flip-flopper that came through ATC headquarters, and learned about what worked for people and what didn't. And so then when we were ready to start really promoting them in 2015, we felt like we had a good foundation and understanding of what approaches worked best for people. And so 2015 is when we started our initiative called Protecting the AT Hiking Experience, or PATH. And the AT camp came out of that. We started promoting alternative through hikes, and we had the first annual flip-flop festival here in Harpers Ferry to raise awareness of flip-flopping and educate hikers on how to go about it. So with infinite number of variations, flip-flops, literally, there are probably a million combinations that you could do. How do you choose one? So we're going to recommend a few, or let you know what have been most popular, but give you the tools to fashion your own if you want. Elevation is just a huge factor in determining what kind of weather you're going to have. So people tend to think about the north-south latitude in terms of where and when to start, but elevation is so variable on the AT, it just makes a huge difference. So in fact, Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, in the middle of the trail, 1,000 miles north of the southern terminus, typically has similar weather to the trail in Georgia because the elevation is so much higher. So I often look at Blood Mountain, Georgia, and Harpers Ferry and compare, and they're often quite close, as a matter of fact, in terms of temperature. So I just looked last night what I could find online, and yesterday, Blood Mountain, the low was 37 with wind speeds 10 to 20 miles an hour. Harpers Ferry was 31 degrees, wind speed 4. Mount LeConte in the Smokies, which is comparable to the highest point on the AT, in the Smokies had temperature of 9 degrees, 8 inches of snow. So the places that are highest, even if they're in the south, can have colder, wetter, and windier temperatures than places further north. So it's kind of counterintuitive if you're just looking at a flat map. So if you look at this profile here, you can see Harpers Ferry going north has the lowest elevation of the whole trail. So that's what makes it such a great starting point if you're looking for an alternative. So you also need to look at terrain, because another sort of counterintuitive thing is that elevation does not necessarily correspond with difficulty of terrain. If you look at this picture that just went up, that's Pennsylvania, which if you look at a profile is pretty flat, but northern Pennsylvania has some pretty rugged, rocky terrain that you don't want to start like at Duncannon, say, or Port Clinton, or Wind Gap in the northern part of the state, because you want to get your trail legs before hitting that, even though the terrain is pretty flat, except for the wind and water gaps. Another factor to consider is access, how easy it is to get to the trail, especially if you're using public transportation. Another factor is resupply. You're going to go through areas where there's dense resupply and areas where it's very lean. And you probably don't want to start in an area if you're a novice where resupply is very far apart, because that means you have to start with a heavier pack. So why not leave those more remote areas for later when you're stronger, you've learned how to lighten your pack and you can carry more weight. And then finally, another factor to consider is the no-bow bubble. It's not that you want to avoid northbound through hikers altogether, and it can be great to have companionship with northbounders. It's just you don't want to be in the middle of the bubble. You want to probably be on the edges of the bubble. And if you, there's a website called wherearethehikers.com that has a heat map with 15 years of data of trail journals that show on any given day where the northbound through hiker is reported being on those days. It's not comprehensive or up to date, but it's a really great tool to understand the patterns of northbound through hikers. So now we're going to talk about some variations that have worked well for people, some of the more popular ones. And by the way, popular flip-flop bubble, I mean, 10 people, 6 people constitute a flip-flop bubble as opposed to like 50 or 100 northbounders. So when we talk about flip-flop bubbles or being popular, it's a whole different scale from northbound. So anyway, Harper's Ferry has so much going for it. It is an incredibly historic spot, scenic spot. There's public transportation with both an Amtrak and commuter trains from DC, and you can get to DC from anywhere in the world. It also has a lot of services with ATC headquarters here, lodging options, outfitter. And so this Harper's Ferry no-bow, you start in Harper's Ferry on the first leg, and the most popular version for the second is to go southbound. We have more information on our website about what you get in those details. So let's talk about flip-flop starting in Shenandoah National Park. That's another popular place to start, but it's a little more complicated because so you get 160 more miles of relatively easy terrain to get your trail legs before hitting the Pennsylvania rocks. The thing is, if you remember that chart we were looking at before, elevation is higher, meaning it's colder, wetter, and windier. So you can have that longer time to get ready for the Pennsylvania rocks, but the trade-off is it's going to be colder, wetter, and windier than starting in Harper's Ferry at the same time. And there's also the issue that the services gradually open from March through May. So if you like started in early April, you might not get those blackberry milkshakes that you've heard about. You might not be able to get a room in a lodge and get a nice hot shower the way folks who get there later might. So there are pros and cons for that. Now we've got a couple 3-part types of flip-flops. One is so more transportation, but it helps maximize the optimal terrain and weather. So this Leapfrog is a 3-part hike starting in Georgia, going to Harper's Ferry or someplace somewhere in the middle or until it gets hot. It retains elements of the no-bow because you're starting in Georgia. And then what you do is when it starts to get hot or you reach Harper's Ferry or some other designated point, you take your public transportation up to New York. There's 3 legs to that, but there's direct connections straight from one point on the trail to the next in New York, north of the Hudson River. You can hike north to Katahdin, get that magnificent view, build your trail legs for the Whites and Southern Maine, the most difficult part of the trail before you're completely worn out and exhausted, which can happen on a northbound hike. And then, oh yeah, and so the best part really is skipping the hot, sticky, humid mid-Atlantic in summer where it can be so hot you can't even sleep. And then instead you get to hike that southbound in the fall colors. Okay, here's another 3-part flip-flop that everybody asks about because it's got such an intriguing name, Cool Breeze. Well, it was designed by a guy who had the trail name Cool Breeze because he designed a hike that he thought would maximize weather conditions throughout the whole trail, not too hot, not too cold. He did 2 through hikes previously, I think in 78 and 88. And he also worked as a volunteer on ATC's trail crews. So he was roving up and down the trail all times of year. So he got to know the trail really well. And he just constructed this hike based on his knowledge of the trail at different times of the year. And he also lived in New England, and he was choosing a hike that would allow him to start from home. So this 3-part hike starts around Connecticut, New York, goes south through the mid-Atlantic early in spring while it's still cool. Then you flip up to your starting point, hike north to Katahdin, and then come back and hike the south in the fall with the fall colors. And this one works particularly well for folks who live in New England and don't want to travel too far to the start of their hike. All right, and I just wanted to note about Cool Breeze, what he did is by volunteering on a trail crew, somebody had said they talked about mental attitude. And I think when you volunteer before a thru hike, it really helps you with your mental attitude because you understand what goes into building and maintaining the trail. And it just, you know, you're walking in awe and gratitude and so positive for, you know, every step of the way. And while other hikers are just complaining all the time about the rocks and the mud and the puds, you have a whole different perspective. And so, plus it helps you get in shape and you meet other long distance hikers who are volunteers. It's just, I can't recommend volunteering strongly enough. So if flip-flopping has all these great things going for it, you know, why doesn't everybody do it? What are some of the challenges? Well, there's explaining what a flip-flop is, because a lot of people don't know what it is, and that can get tiresome. And to some people, you're going to even have to defend, like, is this a real thru hike? Well, ATC is here to tell you it's a very real thru hike. And in fact, you know, it's helping the trail. So, but you're still going to have to explain that to other people. You can't be a person who follows the crowd, what's most popular, because, you know, you're just going to have to deal with these questions of people saying, well, that's not a thru hike. Why are you doing it that way? You have to be very, you know, convinced that you're doing what you want to do. There is the additional transportation expense. And then there's the issue of when you're climbing Katahdin and if you're hiking with northbounders, you know, they're, yay, all done, go home, trip is over. And then, but you're not done. And so how do you manage that? It's easy to go home, take a break, and then sort of get in the couch potato mode. And it can be somewhat difficult to get the motivation to get back on trail and do that hard work of hiking 8, 10, 12 hours a day. But successful flip-floppers have told me that it's really, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, you know, a chance to kind of reflect and reset, you know, contemplate what your hike is about, what you want for the second half. Instead of just kind of zoning out and pounding out the miles until you get to the end, and then a thru hike is often over before you know it. And then if you're on the fence, there's also the issue that you are showing the trail some love by doing a non-traditional thru hike outside the bubble in the crowds. So that helps preserve the trail. For 2021, just want to make clear that we are not advocating that everyone go out and do one of the flip-flops that we've been talking about this year because of COVID. So we, you know, say if you wanted to start early this year, you know, in April or May, you know, if that's what you're wedded to, you may have to just postpone. No go this year, consider it next year. Consider doing a shakedown hike and an alternate trail close to wherever you live. And I did talk to a hiker yesterday who's planning what we sometimes call an inside-out flip-flop, which is starting in Harper's Ferry and heading south to Georgia. And normally for springtime, it's not one that we necessarily recommend because then you're going through the bubble of no-bows, but if you did that in the fall, that would not be an issue. And so his plan is to start in mid-August, hike south to Georgia in Thanksgiving, take the winter off, come back mid-April to Harper's Ferry and head north to Katahdin and do it within that 12-month range. No guarantees that we'll have a widely available vaccine by mid-August, but certainly hope so. just throwing that out there as a possibility. Just some tips from talking to hundreds of flip-floppers, what has worked for the majority of them. And that is waiting until mid-April or May for the milder weather, because so many NOVAs start in March. People think, well, I'll do my flip-flop in March too. Well, if you do, you're gonna have cold weather, no matter where you do it. If you're a fast hiker, or you just really feel like nothing's gonna stop you from starting in March next year, then you wanna start your flip-flop, if it's the traditional or the more common one, going north to Katahdin, go further south, Roanoke or someplace like that. So yeah, you don't want the ice storms, which can come as even in early April in Shenandoah or even this area. You want to wait till those flowers are blooming. Don't keep up with the nobos, or you might be doing what the guy in the picture is. Instead of trying to keep up with them, just pick their brains, get all their pro tips after they've hiked 1,000 miles and learn from them, and just accept that you're going to be slower. You just have to live with that and embrace it. And eventually you'll be able to keep up with them if that's what you want. But it's going to take you several weeks or even a few months. Whatever type of flip-flop you're planning, when you're in New England, make sure, or headed toward New England, make sure you don't get to Vermont until Memorial Day or after, because of mud season. So mud season is no fun for the hiker. It's also really bad for the trail. I won't explain that here, but you just Google mud season Vermont and you'll read about it. So work around that. And then we recommend hiking north to Katahdin, because for a couple of reasons. One is just getting that magnificent view first, like 100 miles away, and then you get closer, you can click. It gets closer and closer and closer. And it's just this heart pounding experience to see it. Every glimpse of it, you get bigger and bigger. It's really a dramatic experience that you can't, you just don't feel as much going southbound. And then the logistics for the 100-mile wilderness, and especially Katahdin and Baxter State Park, are somewhat complex. But if you go northbound, you can go to the Monson Visitor Center, which can really prep you and help you go do that all successfully. And there's a lot to learn, which I won't try to explain here. That's why they're there. And so ultimately, you can start anywhere. You can construct any kind of sequence or direction that you like, but just do your research and know before you go. And also want to make a pitch for the Flip Flop Festival. It was canceled this year. It's going to be canceled in 2021, but it's on for 2022, and it's a great experience. Harpers Ferry, usually the end of May. Hope to see you there. So thank you guys for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, Lori, for giving us all your expertise on flip-flopping. Lori is the mother, unofficial mother of Flip-Flopping Festival, and all the knowledge that comes with it. If you have any questions for Lori or I, here are emails. Feel free to jot them down. But I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and Stephen, who have been answering all of your questions along the way. I saw a lot of lighting up of the chat box. So are there any additional questions that we haven't answered yet, Catherine?
Well, there's just one that I think that's for Lori, and it might take you a minute to look something up, Lori. So if you can't get to that before 1 o'clock here, maybe Adrienne can give us her email address for the answer. But Adrienne was asking if we know how many folks have ever done a yo-yo. So I'll give you a minute to look that up, and if anybody else has any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat here.
And maybe define yo-yo for someone that might not know.
Yes, because we talked about NOBO, northbound, Georgia to Maine, SOBO, Maine to Georgia, the flip-flop, anywhere in the middle. And then a yo-yo through hike is 2 through hikes back to back. So you might hike from Georgia to Maine and then back down to Georgia. Or of course, if you started southbound, you'd go the other way. That is a pretty intense thing to do that I think is only possible for folks who are really speedy hikers to do it in a year or not be encountering crazy weather.
Okay, I just did a quick check. This question comes up periodically, and it's roughly 10 or so people who have done a yo-yo, and they're actually people that have done double yo-yos, if you can believe that, like 4 consecutive hikes.
That's wild.
But we don't have a checkbox on our 2,000 miler application, so I can't say that's absolutely definitive, but that's our best guess.
We have a question from Siobhan. Is it plausible to do state by state over 12 months, trying to balance work hike life balance?
There are actually people that have completed the AT by day hikes. So anything is possible.
Yeah, I think the logistics get more complex, you know, the more times you hop on and off the trail, but you also get those nice breaks, and you keep the you don't get into the mindset that some northbound hikers get into, where it's just like a grind and they're not really appreciating the trail as much. I would, since I'm here in Virginia, I always have to say, when folks want to think about doing the trail state by state, remember that the state of Virginia is about a quarter of the trail. It's 550 miles. So if you do that, you're going to need a month or more perhaps to get through Virginia. Lori, sorry if I was distracted looking at the chat box and stuff. I may have missed it. Did you talk at all about our list of alternative trails that we put together?
I did not mention that. Thank you for asking. In the hiker resource library on our website, we do have a list of alternative trails, and actually it will probably be growing in the coming months as people reach out to us and make recommendations. They're basically ones East Coast, but we have a couple dozen, and yeah, there's ones that are, I think we've listed ones that are 30 miles or more in length. So they're all over the place, and many of these are really need use and would benefit from additional use. They have in some cases the opposite problem of the AT.
I have a question, if I may. If you're considering this and you want to connect up with other people who might share, you know, some of your commonalities, like if you wanted to find a women's group, or if you wanted to find people over 50 that you could possibly do a through hike with, what would you suggest is the best way to try to connect with particular groups if you didn't want to do the hike solo?
Well, there's social media has a host of different groups. Most of them are on Facebook. There are women's group specifically. There's a Facebook page. I mean, a Flip Flopper Facebook page. There is a Section Hiker page, and there's places like whiteblaze.net. There are also trail organizations, like for women, there's one called Trail Dames, traildames.com, that has chapters just for women.
Yeah,
There's also Wild East Women. Wild East Women is a new affinity group that started up last year, and it's hosted by ATC and other conservation nonprofits along the East Coast, and women affinity groups, but we promote stewardship projects and recreational opportunities. So we can certainly link to that in a follow-up email.
Got a question here from Ruth for clarification, saying, does ATC recommend groups right now? We're not recommending hiking with anyone outside of your household, of course. And we're also not recommending long distance hikes to start with, but trying to put information out there to help you plan in the safest way possible.
And some hiking groups are having virtual events. Of course, we didn't mention the 31 local AT clubs, and usually every AT maintaining club has someone in the ranks that's looking for hiking partners, experienced hikers. Sometimes they have social events, good places to network, in addition to getting some great volunteer time in. Now, that is restricted now, but there is some volunteer work going on now.
Hi, can I ask another question? Concerning the recognition of 2021 hikes based on the wide availability of the vaccine, will ATC, and I understand why you're doing that, I'm not challenging that, but will the ATC be posting any updates as to whether that possibility is approaching as the year goes on? The reason I'm asking is because I'm hoping to start a southbound through hike in late June, and I probably won't go until I get a vaccine, but that doesn't mean that the vaccine is widely available. So, I'd like to have my hike recognized somehow. So I may have to wait another year for that. But anyway, just throwing that question out there.
I think that ATC is going to be continually updating and monitoring the situation. So while this is like in ways that we're doing right now, we're doing these sessions every week through the end of March. So I think we're going to have a better understanding of what the summer is going to look like come March. But even after these sessions conclude, we'll continue to update hikers. That's our promise.
I'm just going to put one more plug in for those alternative trails, just because I'll just share that I had a friend that I thru hiked with back in 2006 who went and hiked again a couple years later. His name was Yukon Cornelius, and he blue blazed the entire Appalachian Trail. That was his goal, was to hike from Springer to Katahdin without being on the actual Appalachian Trail as little as possible. And there's big chunks of the trail where you can do that. The Tuscarora Trail is another nice long chunk of the trail that parallels the AT from Northern Virginia up into Pennsylvania. So, there's just some really cool trails that you can hike north to south on and have a more, guarantee of solitude. And maybe that's a cool thing to do in 2021. And the AT will be there for you, in future years.
Thanks for that plug, Catherine. You can find those different trails to hike on in our hiker resources library that everyone should have a link to. It's also, if you go to appalachiantrail.org, it's pretty easy to find on the 2021 recommendations for hikers. We'll leave it at that. It's 1:01, and we thank you guys for taking an hour of your time to sit here and listen with us. Happy holidays.